Hello, and welcome to another episode of Climbing on the Bookshelf. I hope that you all had a great Christmas and New Year, and you met up with family and friends and ate and drank and were merry, and you all got what you wanted on your lists. This year is my third year of my podcast, and I'm going to start off with an absolute cracker. It's one that I recorded back in late October with the amazing author Scott Ellsworth. He's written numerous books with varying topics. You might know him from his works to do with the Tulsa race riots in America in the 1920s. His first book, released in 1982, Death in a Promised Land, and his second book, released almost 40 years later, The Groundbreaking, deals with the atrocities witnessed in Tulsa, Oklahoma in 1921, when mobs of white people attacked black residents and businesses of the Greenwood district. He also wrote A Secret Game, about a clandestine integrated collegiate basketball game that took place in North Carolina in 1944. I could have questioned him more on these subjects, but as it's a climbing literature podcast, I wanted to concentrate on something else he'd written. The World Beneath Their Feet is a story of the race to be the first to summit an 8,000er. The main expedition teams are, of course, the British, then there's the Nazi Germans, and the Americans. As you may or may not know, the first mountain to be summited over 8,000 metres was Annapurna by a very experienced and very strong French team. But that's not the main focus of this book. It delves into the history of all the failed attempts leading up to Everest in 1953. Saying that, you could look at it as every attempt that was made on an 8,000er was a successful reconnaissance for future attempts. There are also missions and expeditions to mountains other than the 8,000ers, where again more experience is gained, such as Nanda Devi or Minya Konka. I can thoroughly recommend this book, even for those of you who aren't into high altitude climbing. Scott is more than happy to answer any questions that you have on any of his books, and he kindly gives out his contact details towards the end of the episode. If you like the sound of any of Scott's books, then you can pretty much get them anywhere you get your books from. I was lucky enough to get sent a copy by Scott of the American version of The World Beneath Their Feet. It's probably the best edition of that particular story. He also wrote a little message in there for me. I'll take a picture of it and post it on social media for all of you guys to see. Also, don't forget to rate and review my show on Spotify or Apple or wherever you get your podcasts from, and don't forget to tell all your climbing friends and family about it. I hope you learn a bit from Scott's interview, as I certainly didn't know much about the American side of the climbing team and found it really interesting. Anyway, here it is. Enjoy. Scott Ellsworth, thanks very much for coming on Climbing on the Bookshelf. I really appreciate you coming on the show.
Well, I'm honored to be on it. Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you. How are you? How's things?
Things are good. They're great. It's a beautiful fall day here in Ann Arbor, Michigan. You know, I'm work is going well. You know, all is good.
Sure. And what is it that you do, and whereabouts do you work?
So I do a couple of things. So sort of three things in a way at the moment. So I'm a lecturer at the University of Michigan. I teach classes on civil rights and race relations and sports as well too, sort of athletic history.
Okay.
I also write books, and I published 3 books in the last 7 years. In addition to The World Beneath Their Feet that we're going to talk about today, I wrote a book called The Secret Game, which is a story about basketball, which is very big in the United States. Yeah, I discovered this clandestine and essentially illegal integrated college basketball game that happened in 1944, 10 years before the American Civil Rights Movement got going. And wrote that book. And then I published a book last year about something called the Tulsa Race Massacre of 1921. The book is called The Groundbreaking. And this is in my hometown of Tulsa, but essentially the worst single incident of racial violence in all of American history happened in my hometown. It was covered up for 50 years. And it's taken us about 50 years to get the story out. And so I'd written the first book, first sort of comprehensive history of the massacre in my 20s, 40 years ago. And this was one sort of bringing the story up to date.
Sure. And that was Death in a Promised Land, is that right, in 82?
Yeah, Death in a Promised Land was the first book I wrote. And then the new one is called The Groundbreaking, which was published in the UK as well.
So do they kind of follow on from each other, but obviously there's a bit of a gap?
Very much so. The first one really told the story of the massacre. The second one tells it very briefly, but really talks about the cover up and the uncovering and our search for the unmarked graves of massacre victims. That's
Okay.
one of the other things I'm doing at the moment, which is I've been part of the leadership of a team who has been going at this for some time. And in fact, next week I'm returning to Tulsa briefly while we begin a new excavation in an area where we have strong evidence that
Sure.
massacre victims were buried in unmarked graves.
Of course.
And
Yeah.
then I
Okay.
then I'm now searching for the subject of my next book. So that's what I've been at
Okay.
for about a year and a half at this point.
Okay. So how did you get into your field of teaching and lecturing?
Well, I've had a sort of unusual career. I went to undergraduate college and went to graduate school. Then I ended up while I was in graduate school, was living in Washington D.C. and I decided at that point I didn't want to be a college professor, and I managed to hang on to that until about the last 15 years or so. And
Okay.
I worked at the Smithsonian Institution, our version of the British Museum,
Yep. Sure.
for a decade. I did film work, journalism, other things like that. And we moved here, I guess it's 17 years ago. My wife and we had 3-year-old twin sons.
Okay.
I was the full time stay at home dad to our boys.
Okay.
While I was also trying to write, didn't get a lot of writing done.
Sure.
And to make a long story short, I was diagnosed with prostate cancer. The surgeons at the University of Michigan saved my life. We were trying to think how to thank the university. We didn't have any money, but people had heard about my work in Tulsa. So a part time job turned into a full time job, and
Wow. It's
I've
amazing.
been happily here ever since.
Yeah. Fantastic. Fantastic. That's really great. The book that we're going to talk about, The World Beneath Our Feet, it's something completely different to what you've written before.
Right.
Obviously, it's kind of in the kind of sports bracket arena, like you in The Secret Game, but I wouldn't say, well, I would say it was a sport, but it's about the British Americans and the Nazi Germans race to the summit of the Himalayas in the
Right.
30s, 40s, and even into the 50s when the first mountains were conquered. Could you tell me about that and what made you write the book?
Sure. So I guess there were a couple reasons in the background. The first is while I'm not a climber in the capital C climber sense, I have done some mountaineering over the years, starting in my 20s when I was an undergraduate out in Oregon, started climbing into Cascades, and then sort of started climbing again a little bit in my 30s. I was on a 10-day expedition in the Wrangell St. Elias mountains in Alaska
Yep.
near the Yukon border, placed on a glacier by a plane that departed and came back a week
It's,
and a half
it's
later.
it's very remote there, isn't it? Yep.
Very remote. So I got a sense of sort of expedition work, and and I'd done some climbing in the Andes, in Switzerland. Nothing significant, but I knew the basics of things. I knew what an ice axe was, what a carabiner was, what a
Okay.
crevasse was. So I was familiar enough, and it was an interest of mine. The other thing is that so I'm 68 years old. My parents were both in World War II. My dad was an intelligence officer for the United States Army Air Corps, later the United States Air Force. All of my mom worked for the Army as well too. All of my uncles and one of my aunts were all in uniform during the war. And growing up, everyone, my little league baseball coaches, my scout leaders, all of our neighbors, they were all a part of World War II. So I had grown up, as my brother and sister had as well, hearing our parents tell the stories of the Great Depression, talking about the war and things like that. And I'd been a student of World War II, all of my life. So then we get to around 2016 or so, and The Secret Game. I'm looking for a new book topic, and I'm sort of all over the map looking at different stories. I'd found what I thought was a good Vietnam story. But then one day I was just noodling on the internet, and I saw a photograph of German mountaineers in the Himalayas during the Nazi era with a swastika flag, and it just
Yep.
blew my mind. I hadn't seen anything like that and thought about it, and then I just sort of burrowed down in the internet, and about 3 hours later I emerged and I said, "There's a book here," and I had the rudiments of kind of what the historical timeline was, and I could tell that this was a race. This is going to be it. So I have a wonderful literary agent in New York City. I checked with him. I gave him both the Vietnam story and the other one, and he jumped at the Himalayas and said, "Absolutely, this is the book to do."
There's a few sort of stories that are wrapped up in the book, all sort of different sections and segments, and it sort of branches off. There's a bit of a British storyline, there's a German and American line as well, with the British looking at Everest, the Germans looking at Nanga Parbat, and the Americans on K2, mainly sort of focusing on those.
Right.
What I really like about the book is the things that you don't know and don't sort of things that don't come to mind about other mountains that were being looked at and being conquered as well. Particular mountain, one sort of thing that stuck out in the book was the mountain called Nanda Devi,
Right.
if that's how you say it. Other
Yeah.
people will say different things, but that's what I'm going to say, what I'll
Right.
call it.
Exactly.
About the expedition to discover that, and it turned out that it was two guys, two British guys, Bill Tillman and Eric Shipton, that broke through to this mythical place that unlocked the sort of ascent to Nanda Devi called the Sanctuary. And
Right.
nobody sort of knew that this was a real place or not, but it took them so long to try and find it. I just wondered how you thought about doing research on that particular thing, which obviously the Everest and the three tallest and Nanga Parbat and
Right.
K2 were probably a lot easier. There's probably a lot more information about them, but the lesser known ones, I'm just wondering how you did the research for those ones.
Right. So, the challenge was in part with the book that there's a lot of expeditions, and I
Yeah.
had to pare things down. And the world beneath their feet, I'm proud to say, has been translated into Italian, into Czech, into Polish, into Slovak. There was also a UK edition, but my ratings in Italy are pretty poor, and I think one reason is because I didn't really write that much about the Italians. I didn't write
Okay.
that much about the French either, which is one reason why I'm sure there's no French edition. But I
Yeah.
guess kind of to answer your question, as somebody who's been trained as a historian, I looked for the larger themes and the big pictures that are going on. And the thing that I learned quite quickly is the absolute central importance of British climbers in the history of mountaineering. And in all honesty, British climbers invent mountaineering. They invent modern mountaineering.
Okay.
They, in terms of techniques and everything else, and we know all of the first ascents in the Alps and all that stuff. But what happened, certainly by the time of the attempts, particularly in the 1920s with Everest, is there is sort of a British style of mountaineering that's reflective of imperial culture at the time. So,
Yeah.
you're going to hire hundreds and hundreds of local indigenous folks to carry your stuff, all of this stuff. And so you have this gigantic, expedition in 1933 after these, former failures, and everyone assumes
Hmm.
that the Brits are going to make it to the top of Mount Everest, and they've been scared because the Germans are starting to make some moves, and that doesn't happen, and then as I dug into that, Bill Tillman certainly became a figure, but more importantly, Eric Shipton. And Eric Shipton is really, in some ways, he is the most important British mountaineer, in my opinion, at all. He's a very creative, very different guy, go his own way kind of guy. But after all of the, oh gosh, aspects of the 1933 expedition, I mean, they had 11,000 crates and things like that of
Yes.
supplies that they brought. He just thought there's got to be a different way of doing this.
He didn't need to take the piano or a boat or something like
Right,
that.
exactly. And so he and Tillman kicked up this idea. Well, we'll try a smaller peak. We'll just go small and go as tiny a group as we can. So they start, what's going to be it's going to be mirrored in what the Americans are doing at the same time. But it's this very much, on the fly, try to eat along the way, don't carry much stuff, expedition to Nanda Devi, which is this legendary place, but nobody had ever been able to, there was this one central peak, very difficult, but also this ring of mountains around them. And they tried to figure out how to get through that ring to this sanctuary where, as far as we know, no human beings had ever been before. And it's just, I read his book on it and studied up on it, and it's just such an incredible saga of what goes on in terms of their creativity, in terms of their courage, in terms of their guts, in terms of how they were able to pull this off obviously with the help of their Sherpas. But what also happened is that the old dividing lines between the European climbers and the Sherpas started to dissolve a bit, on that climb, and that's going to become important later on. But I was just swept up into it, and as soon as I started reading it, I had read James Hilton's Shangri-La, when I was in high school or something.
The Lost Horizon.
Knew the movie, and I said, "Oh my God, this has got to be it." So I was swept up. It was just hard not to get swept up in the, really the romance of that story, and also their incredible accomplishment.
But that was sort of very early alpinism, sort of fast and light, and that was
Right.
the first times that anybody had tried that. I think there were only a handful of Sherpas that were with them at that point as well.
Yes, exactly. I want to think it's.
I'm sure it was 2 or 3 actually. Yes,
yeah,
yes.
exactly.
Reading from your book, yes.
I'm turning to the page to see the photograph, but yes, exactly.
Yes,
It's
in my British book, there are no photographs, and I know that you very, very kindly sent me the photographs from the American version, which they're absolutely incredible. I'm just looking in studying the pictures, you think how mountaineering has changed so much.
Well, it is, and and this is the golden age of mountaineering photography. I mean, particularly with the Germans with their Leica cameras and all of that stuff, and it took. I mean, I spent a fortune getting the rights to the photographs, and I was very sad when my British publisher did not decide to put the photographs in it.
Yeah, I was going to ask you why wasn't it in the
I don't know. I don't know the answer, quite frankly.
Okay. So where did you source the pictures from? Was it
all
Geographical
over
Society and
certainly from national repositories in London and in the US, but a lot of the photos too I tracked down in Germany and elsewhere. A couple from obscure sources here and there, but it was it was quite an effort getting them, and then paying for worldwide rights and all of that stuff.
Sure, yeah. So did you have any sort of key people abroad, kind of helping you and assisting you in, or were you just doing it by yourself?
Absolutely. I mean, the first and foremost there are 2 places. Well, there's more than that, but in terms of assistance, the Alpine Club is obviously is
London.
Is number one. I'm thrilled to be an associate member of the Alpine Club. I mean, there's no more historic and historically important climbing organization in the world. and just being in their archives and working with their archivists there was just simply one of the great thrills of this trip, believe me.
Sure.
But I also, the American Alpine Club, which is in Colorado, in Golden, Colorado, has the largest collection of climbing books and materials in the world. And it's because I'm sure some, zillionaire American capitalists, in the early decades of the century decided we're just going to buy everything. And they did. And it's
Sure.
gigantic, and the people there are fabulous. And that was very easy to work with since I'm an American as well. But
Yeah.
I also had great help in Munich with the Deutsche Alpenverein. Wonderful people there. I hired a young college student who had already written a book, incidentally, to help be a translator for me. And when I was there in Munich, and that was a great help. But the people in Munich were really first class, and also in Innsbruck as well. And then I was helped by actually the Himalayan Club in India as well too. So I've had a lot of people really go out of their way and were very open about all of this, and I salute everyone for that. I really do.
Yeah, you've acknowledged them in the back of the book, haven't you? I believe.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, that must have been quite a list to keep hold of, and like a running total almost
Oh,
of,
it absolutely
people that,
was, and
because you wouldn't want to leave anybody else out.
well, you don't want to leave anybody else out, but the people I did a trek in Nepal, and the trekking company was located in Darjeeling in India, and they helped me track down the family of Ong Tharke, a very
Oh,
famous
fantastic.
Sherpa,
Yeah.
and it was other things like that. But everywhere I went, I was really met with great help and I mean, when you think about this, what we're looking back, particularly in the 1930s, is this very patriotic, nationalistic race that's going on. But in today's world, people were very open to helping any way they could. And I
So,
fell in love with London, incidentally.
oh, really? Okay. Okay. Yeah, the Alpine Club. Did you get to visit? So, have you
Oh
visited all
yeah,
these
I did.
places?
I did. I got to. I think I walked. I mean, in my main trip there, that I was there for, I don't know, 10 days or something. I think I walked more than 100 miles. I got to know that I had my Oyster card on the
Okay.
tube. I had all that down, and then actually my earliest known American forebear from Great Britain had been married in the underchapel of St. Paul's before the Great Fire.
Okay.
So I was able to go there. So I felt in a weird way that I was also coming home.
Just other things that I've noticed when I've actually, to be perfectly honest, now this isn't a lie, I promise you, I actually finished last night when I just before I'd finished the whole book. So the timing couldn't have been any more perfect. It was fantastic.
Right.
And I've got pages of little notes that I've made here, such as when the Americans and the Germans and the British were all looking at these peaks, it was actually the French that swooped in
Yeah.
and made this first ascent of an 8,000er.
Exactly.
Which is, I think that's quite a funny story. And obviously the French guys were quite famous climbers in that whole team. To summit, there was Maurice Herzog and Louis Lachenel, who actually summited, and
Right.
their support team were made up of Gaston Riberfat and who's the other guy? Lionel Terry.
Right.
People like that were in the Alps, summiting all these Alps. I mean, it was such a strong team. I don't see why they wouldn't have summited, because they had so much experience in mountaineering.
Absolutely, and I mean, there's all these national. I don't. Let me just pop in, and then we'll get if you've
Yeah.
got a more of a question. But two things I wanted to do with the book. One was to connect climbing to the history of the moment, and because it's so important, that goes on. And climbers today, like climbers of the 1890s, climbers of the 1970s, none of us, none of them live outside of their time. And,
Mm.
where you can go, where you can't go, what's acceptable, what's not, what the equipment is like, on and
Yeah.
on and on. In the moment that we're having right now, with these long lines of people summiting Everest is just, it's
Yes.
fantastical. I mean, the climbers of the 1930s wouldn't been able to believe that. But as you go, the Germans, it became clear to me that one reason they are so passionate about the Himalayas has to do with what we're trying to recover national pride after their defeat in the First World War. And the Germans bring this team spirit to it. It's not about any individual glory; it's all about team glory. But unlike the Brits, they are very open to innovation, new techniques, new equipment, new different things. The Americans, on the other hand, they've got a sort of a weird history. The American climbing had been centered in these well-to-do Northeasterners who went to Harvard and Yale and these fancy colleges, and they're all trying to mimic what students were doing at Cambridge and Oxford. And but there's not a lot of mountains of any size near to the Northeast. So when they go to the Rockies, the Canadian Rockies, and Alaska, where they can finally find some big peaks, they have a problem. And the problem is there's no local population of quote Sherpas that they can hire to carry their equipment. They have to figure out how to go lightweight and rely on themselves. So there's a different kind of American climbing ethos that gets going as well too. But the French, they had tried one expedition in the 1930s, and it was a great disaster. I mean, they brought I think it was like 87 fillets, which I guess is a larger than a Magnum bottle of champagne. They brought 100 tins of foie gras, all this stuff, and it didn't work. And they're just sort of out of the picture until that incredible summiting of K2 in 1953. And of course, the great book about that is still the best. I believe it is. It might have been passed by Krakauer, but it may be worldwide the best-selling climbing book ever. I mean, it's an astonishing book.
But with the American guys in the book, I'd not actually heard of any of them at all,
Right.
which is really nice to hear about another side that I don't know about. Some of the guys like Charlie Houston and Dick Birdsall and people like that, I just hadn't known them at all or heard of them. But with the sort of storyline with the Americans, I really really enjoyed that side of it.
Oh, yeah, absolutely, and I did as well. Getting to know them. Certainly with the Minnetonka expedition. There's different themes that kind of fly through the book here and there. And one again is going to be the relationships between these, white European or North American climbers, the local populace who are people of color. And and in that Minnetonka expedition, the Americans had this secret weapon,
It's a fantastic
in that
mountain.
they had Jack Young, who was a Chinese American
Yeah,
and who spoke Chinese and all that. But just then learning about his whole history, as a behind the lines American intelligence officer during the war and all that. I found all of these people, the British, Germans, Americans, them all. I found them all to be so fascinating.
yeah, they've each got their own sort of little how can I
Cameo.
put it? Yeah, yeah, and all that. I mean, the story goes from one to the next, and it kind of hops you around all these little these big mountains and little hurdles that they have to get through to things like getting the authority to go and climb this particular mountain or whatever, and it kind of hops around from one to the next, and then all of a sudden it all comes together.
You're exactly right, and and climbing, as your readers will know, every climb or most climbs build on the climbs that preceded them, whether they were successful or failures, and normally failures. But it's
Yeah,
this accretion of knowledge, and that's going to finally allow whoever the first group is to help get to the top.
I've got a little. a little note actually about the founding editor of the Himalayan Journal. I think his name was Mason, I think.
Yeah.
And it said about eventually summiting Everest. And I think he quoted something like it led to this moment due to all the previous efforts in 1921. And it obviously led up to that point, and all that, as you say, all that experience that the British and everybody had learned and accrued. It was due to the people that are kind of standing on their shoulders. If it wasn't for them, then maybe it wouldn't have happened.
Oh, absolutely. No question about that at all. And the other thing that always just struck me in doing the work is just how close all of these expeditions almost got, way back in the 1930s. I mean, in 1934, Schneider and Aschenbrenner with the Germans,
The German side,
they,
yeah.
they could have summited Nanga Parbat, but they knew that they were Austrian and that wouldn't go over well, with the German expedition. Certainly Paul Petzold and until Charlie Houston, got ill on K2, he could have made it as well too.
They
I
were
mean,
so close. Yes.
it's astonishing, that the last 100 yards, the last, whatever it is such a gigantic barrier.
So that kind of leads on from, or leads to rather, the 53 British expedition to Everest.
Right.
Obviously, everybody knows that they summited, and it was actually a day before the coronation of the
Yes.
Queen, and that must have been so difficult to report on and keep everything quiet, just in case, because obviously there was so much going on and people's focus were on somewhere else, but obviously all these little reporters knew that this was possibly going to happen. And there was a particular guy that was on the expedition, I'm trying to think what his name is now. He was a reporter for the Times.
Yes, James Morris, who
That's
became
him.
Jan
Yes, Morris. Yes.
Right.
In the book, you describe the secret code that he came up with to stop the other reporters trying to get in on making the scoop. I thought that was an absolute brilliant plan that he had.
Oh, it's a one.
So
Absolutely.
where did you come across that?
Well, I tracked that down. He had written about it,
incredible.
and or she had written about it. And what's amazing is that once again, the difference between success and failure, almost in anything in mountaineering, is just millimeters. He came up with the right code. He was going to get it, but they had to telegraph from, I can't remember, from Gilgit or someplace to another place, and there was an Indian telegraph operator who decided to change the wording of this carefully coded message, but luckily he didn't change it enough that people in Kathmandu could figure it out, and then they could get the message to London. But I mean, what an incredible moment, and I hope I captured something of it. But as all throughout London, they're so excited. Elizabeth is about to be crowned.
Yes.
And as they're waiting there, the news comes of Everest. And I mean, I just can't imagine what a joyous moment that must have been.
Just to think so far ahead to stop these people, and they wanted the scoop of being summited, and it was amazing.
Well, I think certainly with the whole code and all of that, but when we get to the news being announced and the crowds erupting in joy, and then Kenneth Mason later walking across, Hyde Park or whatever. He's got this. I mean, he's one of those old hands, and he knows, what this means, and that it's climbed on the back of everyone else. I think that moment, and it's tricky too, because the Brits had to learn certain things. The first plan is they were not going to have Tenzing and Hillary go up. They were going to make sure that they had an actual British members of their teams plant the flag.
There was two others that went up just before them and had to come back.
They had to come back down. I don't think the team members really cared, but I think probably the folks back in London did. So you learn certain things along the way, and they became open to the fact that it was going to be, a Tibetan, Nepali, Indian Sherpa, as well as a New Zealander who were going to be the first up. But that was okay, and that's kind of it's a metaphor for how things were changing, in the world at that time at the end of War II, the collapse of the empire, all of that. That's all a part of that. It looks to the future as well. But I think that moment, and when that news was announced at, back in London, that's one of the great triumphant moments of all of British mountaineering. And it just
Yeah.
goes all the way back. And, it's a crowning achievement. It really is.
To do with the same expedition, one of the evenings in Kathmandu, the team stayed
Yes.
in the embassy.
Right.
Really nice plush rooms and lovely beds and all lovely thick carpets and all sorts. And the Sherpas that they hired were actually staying in this little former stable. I thought that was another humorous side to the book as well.
No, it was. And the Sherpas, then urinated on the wall.
On the wall outside.
But it's, but I mean that goes as well. You kind of have to put yourself in the mindset of the times, but that also shows, I mean, that's in 1953. That also shows how incredible Shipton and Tillman were 19 years earlier, when they are eating out of the same pot with the Sherpas, on Nanda Devi. Those strict racial laws are breaking down, and the Americans weren't at all immune to this either. Obviously, America has a huge problem with race and racism, but it was Paul Petzold on these late 30s K2 climbs, who was this Westerner, cowboy who wasn't a part of this elite Northeastern set. He's the one who starts teaching the Sherpas how to rappel, starts showing them all this stuff. So, and as we know today, the only way that these current expeditions can at all survive is if the Sherpas and the clients are on more of an even level.
You mention a little bit in the book a British guy called Maurice Wilson.
I tell the one chapter version of it.
Yes, which is amazing.
The thing that struck me about the Maurice Wilson story were a couple things. I mean, he was clearly an eccentric, and he's on some sort of a scale at some point. But despite the fact that he's so ill prepared for everything, he is just got this incredibly headstrong personality. I mean, the fact that he even made it to India flying, this plane alone with
incredible,
with a map torn out of like a high school world atlas is just astonishing. And then, of course, he's portrayed as this nutball, eccentric, which on a certain level he was. There's no question about that. But sort of as a clown and not anybody, Eddie the Eagle type, whatever. But what I found so interesting is that the climbers, particularly the climbers who discovered his body, they didn't view him that way. And they viewed what he did as something that was worthy of respect. It's just amazing. I mean, one of the great thrills was, of course, seeing his actual diary and holding that in my hand.
Goodness. Wow. That'd be amazing.
But he's, he's a lesson about a lot of things, about how dangerous mountaineering is. And that if you're not prepared, bad things can happen. He's also this human saga of this very strange individual who actually made a great accomplishment, despite the fact that it ended in his death.
And that's what I love about The World Beneath Their Feet. Is it includes everybody and obviously some kind of quirky stories as well.
Great.
I think what you've written is amazing. I think more people should read it. Even if you're not into mountaineering, it's a kind of rollicking adventure, which is incredible. Which is kind of typical of the time, isn't it? I guess.
Oh yeah, absolutely. But extraordinary people doing extraordinary things. Absolutely.
Yeah. Thank you very much for writing it. It's an incredible book. And actually, I wouldn't have heard about it if one of my other guests hadn't mentioned it on my show previously. There's a guy called Tarquin Cooper who's big into mountaineering, and he commentates in the Red Bull X Alps and the Ice Climbing World Cup and things like that. He loves that sort of era, like as you say, the golden age of mountaineering. And if it wasn't for him, I wouldn't know about the book, or I would have picked it up a lot later. But I'm so glad that I picked it up, and I think it's a fantastic read.
Oh, well, thank you so much. That really means a great deal to me. It was a lot of work, but it was a labor of love, absolutely.
So,
And I was just honored to be the one who got to do it.
so how long did it take you in total to think of the idea and then get it to press?
Oh, like 4 years or something like that.
Okay,
I'm
yeah,
not sure. I mean, I had mountains of it was wading through all these various different reports and trying to put stuff together and then match it with what was happening in the world at the
yeah, sure,
time. And that took quite a bit of work. But I was thrilled that it was a finalist for the William Hill Sports Book of the Year in the
yeah,
UK.
on the short list, yeah, it's fantastic.
I ended up I subscribed to the Times when I was writing the book, in part so I could get to their archive online. But I also, after the book came out, one of the sports columnists of the Times mentioned it. I was just thrilled to have all of that happen.
Yeah,
So I would tell your readers, if there's a way you can get the American version, the hardback,
yeah,
it does have the photographs, which add quite a bit. But I've been very it was an honor to write it, and it was a thrill to to hold some of the equipment and letters and whatnot that these men actually used, and to go to some of the places. Obviously I didn't get to Everest, but I did get to the Himalayas, and to Darjeeling and other places as well too. And it was a thrill to do so.
yeah, fantastic. So what's next? What's have you got another
Gosh,
project in?
I've been working now for a year and a half on that. My last book, this American story, made a long list for the National Book Award.
This is the groundbreaking, right?
The reviews were absolutely through the roof. So it kind of put the pressure on. I can't deliver kind of a half baked thing. So boy, I've gotten close a few times in the last year and a half to the point of I wrote a 50-page book proposal that my agent and I looked at, and we just decided it just wasn't quite there. So
Okay.
it takes work, to do something that you think can make a contribution, can inspire people, but can not, pull any punches either, but tell part of our story. So I
Yeah,
don't know.
sure.
I'm on to a couple things right now, and I'm hopeful that something will happen. But I'll get there at some point.
Is there anything else that you want to discuss? Because I think I've mentioned everything that I would like to know about the book, or the listeners would like to know, I'm sure. But if there's anything that we've missed that you think is key, other than where you can get the book from, where you'd prefer it to be bought from.
Oh, well, no, either I
Um,
mean, I'd love to have you buy the British copy as well too, but if you run into an American, if you like it so much, the photograph,
yeah.
the American copy one. No, I love John Murray. I was so honored that they're my British publisher, that they published Jane Austen and Darwin and everybody and their brother.
Okay. Yeah.
I'm thrilled to be with them. No, I just hope that if not the golden age of mountaineering, it is certainly a golden age of
Yeah.
mountaineering. I think your readers will find, whether they're climbers or armchair climbers, or neither, that I wanted to write a human story about the incredible endurance and ability and resilience of these remarkable men and women, during that era, who are climbing when they have no decent working oxygen systems. They have very few maps, they have very few photographs. Nobody has been to where they're going before. They're having to face all these challenges. They're getting very, very close to summiting all of these peaks quite early, and I think it's a very inspirational story, and I hope that readers find it that way,
Yeah.
to be that way as well.
Yeah. I'll look out for an American version with the photos, because I think, as you say, that is slightly missing. It would just work very well to see the actual photos that you're talking about. I mean, obviously you've got pictures in your mind and you've probably done a bit of research and had a look, but to have it in your hands and see the actual plates in the book. So where can people get hold of you or follow you or?
Um, The easiest way to find me
Yep.
would be simply to look up my name, Scott Ellsworth,
Yep.
at the University of Michigan, and I'll pop up. There'll be some page with me on it,
Yep.
and it has my email address. I'll give it to people now as well. It is SCOTTELL at UMICH.edu. But
Okay.
you're certainly welcome to post that as well too.
Sure.
I'm sure if somebody reached out to John Murray and my publisher in London, they can get a message to me. But I'm on Twitter and things like that. So
Okay. Sure. It would
I,
be enough to
I'm
find.
happy to. I love interacting with my readers,
Yeah.
and would be happy to at any time.
Well, that'd be fantastic. Yeah. Thank you for that. Thank you. But it's been an absolute pleasure having you on the show. It's been absolutely amazing. I'm so pleased that you said you'd like to. I think it's fantastic. Thank you.
Well, I'm thrilled, and once again, your podcast is terrific,
Oh, thank
and
you.
I will spread the word.
Okay, that's very kind of you. Thank you.
Thank you, Stuart, and thank you to everyone listening.
And I hope everything goes well with what you're doing as well. It's fantastic.
Well, we'll get there somehow.
We'll keep in touch as well.
Thank you.
All right. Thanks very much for your time. Thanks.